Thank you very much. I'm very, very happy to be here with all of you today. I think I saw some of you at Freedom Fest and Pork Fest. And I'm happy to be here. I've always had an affinity for libertarianism and for liberty, particularly. You having trouble hearing me? Okay, sorry. But when I think I told this story when I was at Freedom Fest. When I was a little kid, I had kind of a flirtation when I was 13 or 14 years old with communism, because it seemed like a fair system to me, that it was, to each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. It seemed like a utopian, wonderful system. And my father had a conversation with me where he said that the problem was that it required tight government control of almost every human transaction and activity. And he said that the societies that we admire most were societies that maximize liberty. And he gave me the example of the Stoics and the Athenians. He said authoritarian systems inevitably end up focusing on military enterprises and putting the energy of the entire society into war making. And most people don't have any memory or any knowledge of any of the names of the great generals of the Stoics, the great heroes. But he says everybody, but the Athenians were the opposite. Their objective was to maximize liberty. And we all remember today the poems of Aeschylus, the plays of Sophocles, the wisdom and the philosophy of Aristotle, of Socrates, etc. And we remember, and we see that the elevation of the human spirit, of culture, of poetry, of art and literature that occurred under the Athenians and with their sculpture, with their architecture, et cetera. And that's what we admire most. And that only happens in systems that maximize human freedom and maximize the capacity of for the elevation and inspiration of the human spirit. I think one of the reasons that libertarianism appeals to me is the optimism about human nature. In its natal state, human beings have a yearning, deep spiritual yearning, to help people, to be kind, to be compassionate, to sacrifice, to be altruistic. And we all understand just from experience that when we're ordered to do those things, they become stale and they become polluted and tainted. And that the place where those things flourish, where we see them, is in communities. And communities that are not governed with totalitarian controls but are governed by markets, which means free choice. And my experience as an environmental litigator and advocate has validated that throughout my career. So I went to work for people, and I worked for 35 years for commercial fishermen on the Hudson River, but also all around the country. And these were small business people. They had on the Hudson, we have the oldest commercial fishery in North America. It's 350 years old. And we have a fishery that's a traditional gear fishery. The fishermen used the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians to the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam and passed down through the generations. The oldest commercial fishery continuously operating in North America. One of the enclaves of the fishery is a little village called Crotonville, New York, which is 30 miles north of New York City on the east bank of the river. The people who lived there in 1966 were not your prototypical affluent environmentalists. They were factory workers, carpenters, lathers, electricians. Half the people in Crotonville made their living, or at least some part of it, fishing or crabbing the river. So they were capitalists. They were people who had little expectation that they'd ever see Yosemite or Yellowstone or Aspen or Jackson Hole. For them, the environment was their backyard. It was the bathing beaches, the swimming holes, the fishing holes, the Hudson. This was their property value. It was their recreation. It was their livelihoods. It was everything to them. And in 1966, the Penn Central Railroad began vomiting oil from a 4.5-foot pipe in the Croton-Harmon rail yard. The oil went up the river on the tides, and it blackened the beaches, and it made the shad taste of diesel. So they couldn't be sold at the Fulton Fish Market in New York City. And all of the people in Crotonville came together in a room about this size. There was 300 people in the room that night. It was the American Legion Hall. Crotonville was a very patriotic community. It had one of the highest enlistment rates, the highest mortality rates during World War II. Virtually the entire male population joined the Marines the day after Pearl Harbor. These were people, these weren't radicals. They weren't almost all the original founders, board members, and officers of Riverkeeper, which was at that point called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, were former Marines. They were combat veterans from World War II, from Korea, some of them from Vietnam. They weren't radicals, they weren't militants, they were people whose patriotism was rooted in the bedrock of our country. But that night they started talking about violence. And because they saw something that they thought they owned, which was the waterways, the Hudson, and the fisheries that their parents had been exploiting for generations, that was now being robbed from them by large corporate entities over whom they had no control. And they had been to the government agencies that are supposed to protect Americans from pollution, to the Corps of Engineers, the State Conservation Department, and the Coast Guard. And in each case, they were given the bum's rush. These were captive agencies. And the first head of the Fishermen's Association, a guy called Richie Garrett, he was a grave digger from Austin, New York. And he was a former Marine combat veteran from Korea. He and another Marine named Art Glauca on 20 occasions visited the Corps of Engineers office in New York City and begging the Corps Colonel to do his job and shut down the Penn Central pipe. And finally, the Corps Colonel told them in exasperation, these are important people. Speaking of the Penn Central Board of Directors, we can't treat them that way. In other words, we cannot compel them to comply with the law because they're too important. And by this evening in March of 1966, when all these men and women gathered in the American Legion Hall, everybody in Crotonville had come to the conclusion that government was in cahoots with the polluters and was allowing these monopolies to destroy their flourishing businesses, not because they were better at managing the business, but simply because they had better contacts in government. And they were talking about ways to reclaim the river for themselves. They come to the conclusion that the only way that they could do that was if they confronted the polluters directly. And somebody suggested that they put a match to the oil slick coming out of the Penn Central pipe and burn up the pipe. Somebody else said they should roll a mattress up and jam it up the pipe and flood the rail yard with its own waste. Somebody else suggested that they put float a raft of dynamite into the intake of the Indian Point power plant, which at that time was killing 1 million fish a day on its intake screens and taking food off their family tables. And then a guy stood up whose name was Bob Boyle. He was first lieutenant in Korea, and he had become the outdoor editor of Sports Illustrated magazine. He was there for 65 years. 2 years earlier, he had written an article about angling in the Hudson for Sports Illustrated. And in researching that article, he came across an ancient navigational statute called the 1888 Rivers and Harbors Act. And that statute said that it was illegal to pollute any waterway in the United States. You had to pay a big penalty if you got caught. But also there was a bounty provision that said that anybody who turned in the polluter got to keep half the fine. And he had sent this law over to the libel lawyers at Time Magazine, which owned Sports Illustrated, and he knew them because from his long experience there. He said, "Is this still good law?" They sent a memo back saying, in 80 years, it's never been enforced, but it's still on the book and it's good law. And that evening, when all these men and women were talking about violence, he stood up in front of them with a copy of that law and the memo from the lawyers. And he said, we shouldn't be talking about breaking the law. We should be talking about enforcing it. And they resolved that evening that they were going to start the group that was then called the Hudson River Fishermen's Association. Later we changed the name to Riverkeeper. They were going to go out and track down and prosecute every polluter on the Hudson. 18 months later, they shut down the Penn Central Pipe. They got to keep $2,000, which was a huge amount of money in Crotonville, New York in 1968. There were 2 weeks of wild celebration in the town, and they used the money that was left over to go after Ciba Geigy, Tuck Tape, Standard Brands, American Cyanamid, the biggest corporations in our country, and bringing them to justice and collecting bounties. In 1973, they collected the highest penalty in United States history against a corporate polluter. They got $200,000 from Anaconda Wire and Cable for dumping toxics in Hastings, New York. They used that money to construct a boat, which they began patrolling the river looking for polluters. They hired a full-time riverkeeper, a former commercial fisherman named John Cronin, in 1983. He hired me a year later as the prosecuting attorney for the group. And then I spent 35 years suing polluters on the Hudson. And I brought over 500 lawsuits against corporate polluters. We forced polluters to spend over $5.5 billion remediating the river. And today, the Hudson River is an international model for ecosystem restoration and protection. This was a waterway that when I began working on it was catching fire. It was turning color. Every week, different colors, depending on what color they were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Terrytown. It was dead water, zero dissolved oxygen for 20-mile stretches north of New York City, south of Albany. Today, it's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the North Atlantic. It is the last major river system left in the North Atlantic that still has a strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. It's a species warehouse, it's Noah's Ark, it's the last refuge for many of these animals that are going extinct elsewhere. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of water keepers all over the country. We now have 350 water keepers. We became the biggest water protection group in the world. Each one has a patrol boat. They have a full-time paid water keeper, and they sue polluters, so they enforce the law. I've worked for them now I worked for 35 years, so I retired about 5 years ago. But I learned a lot about it. It guided my worldview, the experience that I had with the fishermen. And one of the lessons that I learned, the first lesson, was that the waterways, like the fisheries and other parts of the common, belong to the people. Everybody had the Constitution of the state of New York says that everybody in New York State, every kid in New York City, has a right to go throw a fishing plug in the river and bring out their share of the fish. That those things that are not susceptible to private property ownership, the things that by their nature are part of the community, the commons, the commonwealth, the public trust assets, that those assets, that everybody has a right to use them. The air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, the aquifers, the national forests. Everybody has a right to use them. Nobody can use them in a way that will diminish and injure their use and enjoyment by others. This is ancient law. It goes back to Roman times. It was in the Code of Justinian, which was one of the first efforts at constitutional governance. And the Code of Justinian said that if you're a citizen of Rome, you have an absolute right to go across the beach, throw in a net, and take out your share of the fish. The emperor himself couldn't stop you. But any time that totalitarian regimes begin eroding democratic or constitutional governance, one of the first features of totalitarianism is the privatization of the commons. So when the Roman Empire collapsed in 375 AD, with the burning of the library in Alexandria and the Dark Ages, 800 years of darkness and ignorance and totalitarian rule began, one of the first things that we saw in every jurisdiction and every constituency of Europe was the efforts by local lords and local kings and warlords to privatize the public trust. So in England, for example, King John said that the deer, the hare, the rabbits, the other game animals, which used to belong to the public, and they were a critical social safety net. If you were a farmer and your crop didn't come in, you could go into the forest and kill a deer and you could feed your family. And King John said, no, those now belong to the landhold holder. So the duke or the lord that was that controlled those lands. That's what got him in trouble with Robin Hood. He also privatized the fisheries. The fisheries were another social safety net. People had the right to go in and catch a fish. Now you had to pay somebody to do that. All the fisheries were privatized and given to friends of the king. He also erected navigational tolls on the Thames and the other rivers of England. So something that was once free was to go up and down the river and enjoy commerce or visit or recreation. And now you had to pay somebody to do that. And those reforms created a revolution in the barons and among the public who rose up. They confronted King John on the field of Runnymede, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which was the Bethlehem of all of our civil rights, all of the Bill of Rights, including, habeas corpus and many others. But if you look at the Magna Carta, it says the true name of the Magna Carta is the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest, because it restored those rights for citizens of Britain to control the public trust assets, the shared assets. And I've sat across from polluters many, many times. We had those rights when we had the revolution in this country descended to the people of the states. And every constitution in our country says, the state constitution says the waterways of the state belong to the people of the state, with the exception of some of the Western states that have these very kind of Byzantine water laws. But in all the other states, the waterways, the fisheries, all the public assets belong to the people. And everybody can use them, but we can use them in a way that diminishes other people's use of them. And I've sat across the table from many polluters, and a lot of them say, oh, I didn't mean to pollute that waterway or fill that wetland, but these are new laws we're not used to, or pollute the air. These were laws that were invented by hippies in 1970 after Earth Day. And, I say, don't know, these are ancient laws. They've been here. There was a lot of them were eroded at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. But the 28 laws that were passed after Earth Day are all laws that were intended to restore free market capitalism and restore ancient rights. And so in fact, in England, I'll just say this, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, there were laws, there was a Clean Air Act that made it a capital crime to burn coal in a stove in London because of the impacts on your neighbors. And in fact, up until 1847 in this country, in every jurisdiction, if you had a factory that put pollution into the air and that pollution got onto your neighbor's property, as little as 1 day a year, your neighbor had an absolute right to shut down that factory, to close the nuisance. And we changed those to make way for the Industrial Revolution. But I would argue the pendulum went too far. And then in 1970, it was redressed with the passage of these laws, 28 laws, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, that just restored the ancient laws. The other thing that I learned from my work with the Riverkeeper is that this idea that we have to choose between environmental policy and economic policy is illusory. In 100% of the situations, I would argue, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure the economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generation, and how it preserves and safeguards the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters have been asking us to do, and their indentured servants in our political process, which is to treat the planet as if it were business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, and we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cause of our generation's pollution and prosperity onto the backs of our children. And one of the things that I've done over the past 40 years as an environmental advocate is to constantly go around and confront this whole argument that the diminishment, that investment in the environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in our infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. Is an investment that we have to make if we want to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and future generations. And, we're not protecting the environment for the sake of the fishes and the birds. We're protecting it for our own sake because nature enriches us. It enriches us economically, culturally, spiritually. It is the infrastructure of our community, the air, the water, the lands, the rivers, the landscapes that connect us to our past, to our history, that provide context to our communities, and that are the source of our values, ultimately our virtues, our character as a people, and also something more ephemeral, which is our relationship with our Creator. God talks to us, to human beings, through many vectors, through each other, through organized religion, through the great books of those religions, through wise people and the prophets, and through art and literature and music and poetry, but nowhere with such detail and texture and grace and joy as through creation. And when we destroy these things that we can't recreate, a species, we're destroying diminishing part of our children's capacity to sense the divine, to understand who God is, and therefore who the Creator is, and what our own potential is as human beings. And that's not only would I argue that it's a crime to privatize the commons, but it's also akin to a sin. It's something that has moral intonations. And it's all pollution ultimately is about privatizing the commons. When General Electric dumped this, we cleaned up the Hudson. The fisheries are there now. They're abundant, but they're contaminated with PCBs from the General Electric company. And so the fisheries, there were almost 2,000 fishing families working the Hudson when I started. Now there's, I think, only 2 left. And they're gone not because their business model didn't work. They're gone because the General Electric Company had better lobbyists than they did. They were practicing not free market capitalism, a corporate crony capitalism, which results in monopoly and these huge disparities in wealth and the displacements of power. And, the General Electric Company privatized all the fish in the Hudson River. So the Constitution of the state of New York says those fish belong to the people, but we can't use them anymore. General Electric owns every fish in the Hudson. And that's what pollution is. It's the appropriation of public property for private profit. And I would say that last lesson that I learned, and maybe the important ones, was the importance of free market capitalism to the environment. And if you go back and look at my speeches from 40 years ago, and you see people asking me, what's the most important thing we can do for the environment? I've said consistently for all this time, free market capitalism, because we don't have that in our country. We have corporate crony capitalism. We have this system of cushy, lavish socialism for the rich and a merciless, barbaric capitalism for the poor. That is all rigged, to funnel wealth upward. And that's, that ultimately is the focus of my campaign. As I saw corporate capture from my first, work as an attorney. And it was easy for them and for me to see it in the pharmaceutical industry and all of these other places, in the war industry. That's what, that is what's governing our country right now. But the reason free markets are important for the environment is because in a true free market economy promotes efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste. And pollution is waste. In a true free market economy, actors would be forced to properly value our natural resources, the commons. And it's the undervaluation of those resources that cause us to use them inefficiently, wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. What polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. When General Electric dumped its PCBs in the Hudson, it went to Governor Kerry and Governor Rockefeller in succession. And both the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation, for both those governors, was telling them, it's illegal for you to dump the PCBs. General Electric was saving a few bucks on every capacitator by dumping it into the river rather than properly disposing it. But in a true free market, if you're an actor in the marketplace, you have to pay for all the costs of bringing your product to market, and that includes the cost of cleaning up your mess, which was a lesson that we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. And General Electric went to these two governors, and one of my best friends was in these meetings with them, and they said to him, "If you force us to," and they were able to outcompete their competitors by underselling them, by imposing their costs on the general public in New York. Everybody in the Hudson Valley now has General Electric's PCBs in our flesh and our organs. And they put all the fishermen out of work. So those were the costs that they were externalizing. And they said to the governors, if you force us to internalize that cost, we're going to move our operations all across the river to New Jersey. And guess what? We're going to move 6,000 jobs. And you're still going to get the pollution because New Jersey's going to let us do that. It's a race to bottom. But they're going to get the taxes and they're going to get the jobs. So Kerry and Rockefeller backed down because of that corporate power, that muscular exercise of corporate power. And then, 10 years later, General Electric closed its factories, All those workers disappeared. General Electric doesn't have a single employee in New York State right now. And we got stuck with a $4.3 billion cleanup bill for the Hudson. And, you know, the fisheries are closed that enrich the culture, the palate, the history of the Hudson Valley for 3.5 centuries. And that was the cost of, you know, of corporate pollution, of corporate crony capitalism. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. That's what all pollution is. And, you know, 1 million people came out on the street when the Cuyahoga River was burning when I was a kid for 8 days with flames that were 8 stories high. They couldn't put it out. That year, 69, the Lake Erie was declared dead, no fish in it, 0 dissolved oxygen. The peregrine falcon, the eastern and Adams peregrine falcon, the most spectacular predatory bird in America, went extinct, was declared extinct. The Santa Barbara oil spill happened. It closed all the coasts of California and cost billions of dollars to local economies. The American people, in reaction to these insults, 1 million people came out onto the street on Earth Day 1970, the biggest public demonstration in American history, demanding that our leaders return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that have been stolen from our citizens over the previous, 80 years. And the political system responded. Republicans and Democrats got together. They created EPA. They passed 28 major environmental laws in 11 years that restored all those ancient laws of nuisance that had been, and public and protecting the public trust that had been abandoned. And that was kind of, those were the experiences that for me validated and guided my thinking about the importance of marketplace. And I'll say, I want to say a little about the energy system, about how you fix the energy system in this country. The big struggle that everybody focuses on is climate change. And that's the only way people now have, the political system has now, of talking about energy policy. And it's a choice which puts everybody in a fist fight and paralyzes everything. If you want to talk about the environment, get widespread agreement, talk about clean air, clean water, wildlife, public health, regenerative agriculture, there's many ways to talk about it. But if you want a fist fight, if you want to paralyze the system, talk about climate. And I knew this, I believe that climate change is man-made, mostly, that it is existential. But I don't insist anybody else believe it, because I also, and we all saw this during COVID, how global emergencies were used by totalitarian forces to clamp down controls and shift wealth upward. And everybody can see that is being used for climate that way right now. I'm watching these corporations like BlackRock and Bruce Ratstetter who are building these, carbon capture, $100 billion subsidies for carbon capture that actually is designed to benefit the oil industry. So, it's all rigged and fixed and corrupt. I see that. And also telling a fisherman on the Hudson, this pollution is destroying your livelihood. He will go to war for that. He'll float a raft of dynamite into a power plant and risk going to jail. But if you tell him you got to save the environment because this line on the graph shows you're going to be dead in 10 years or all humanity, he's not going to do it, because it's a cost that he's having to take your word that this line on the graph is going to happen. And all it's designed to do is to polarize us. And, for me, the way I talk about energy is that we need markets. We need market, and the reason that there are 3 big impediments to us having a marketplace that will liberate Americans' creative energies in the energy sector. The first of those is the giant subsidies to the industry, to the carbon industry. It's about $5.2 trillion a year in subsidies, and that doesn't include the oil wars, which should be internalized. We should, when we pay for gasoline, the gas pump, we should be paying for the oil wars as well. And very few people would be buying gas if they had internalized all their costs to our society. But it's about $5.2 trillion in subsidy. Now, wind and solar are subsidized too. I'm against subsidy, particularly for a mature industry. I don't think there's any justification if you're a mature industry like the pharmaceutical industry, the oil industry, or the military contractors. You should not be getting subsidies. These are the biggest industries in the world. You know, there's a justification for subsidies if you're trying to jumpstart an industry, like George Washington did with the textile industry when he found out that he could not get an American suit for his inauguration. And, you know, and they created these, but they only lasted a few years until the industry got on its feet. So, but if you're a mature industry, there's no excuse. And my inclination is to ban subsidies altogether and have true free market. So that's one of the issues. The second issue, the second impediment is we have this very balkanized, fragmented regulatory system in our country that does not allow for national marketplace. There's 120 control districts, 50 different public utility commissions, and they all have these Byzantine rules that simply do not allow markets to exist. It's and by the way, I was a partner in the biggest green tech venture capital firm in the country, Vantage Point, for over a decade. We were the first investors in Tesla. We built the biggest solar plant in our country, the Ivanpah plant, and we built and another company that I was involved in, Starwood, built the biggest PVC plant in our country in Sault Marie up in Canada. So I was dealing with these issues on the ground, and I played a key role in making sure that making the Ivanpah plant happen. So I was on the front lines, and I saw, you know, the fixes, and the difficulty. Let me give you an example of why this is. I had a home in Mount Kisco, New York. I had a geothermal, state-of-the-art geothermal in that home. Plus, I had state-of-the-art solar systems on the roof. My home, almost every day of the year, was generating more energy than we used. And when I was away in the summer, it was just a power plant. Why can't I sell that power plant back on the grid? Why? There's 38 states that allow you to do that in some level, but none of them allow you to get the same price that the utilities getting. So, you know, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we turning every American into an energy entrepreneur and every home into a power plant and giving people the opportunity to participate in these markets? And so, you know, we have instead an energy system that, as I said, is balkanized, where the rules were written by the incumbents, by the carbon incumbents, to favor the dirtiest, filthiest, most poisonous, toxic, warmongering fuels from hell, instead of the cheap, clean, green, wholesome, and efficient, you know, energy source from heaven. And we need to rationalize the marketplace so that it actually adopts free market principles and people can buy and sell. Perhaps the biggest impediment, that may be the biggest one. The other big impediment is that we don't have an energy grid in this system that can act as a marketplace. So we have 3 different energy grids in the United States, and they're not interconnected. So you can't. We have the best, you know, solar and wind resources, among the best in the world. The Scientific American a couple of years ago did an article that showed that you could finance the entire, or you could provide 100% of the energy to the U.S. energy grid by putting solar panels on an area 75 miles by 75 miles in the desert Southwest. You wouldn't do that for a lot of reasons. One is if a cloud passes over Arizona, you black out the entire country. But what it shows is, if you have dispersed energy and we have plenty, we have the best wind anywhere in the world except for Antarctica. There's enough harnessable wind energy in North Dakota, Montana, and Texas to provide 100% of the US energy grid. Every farmer in North Dakota wants to, one of the windiest places on earth, wants to put wind turbines on their property. Why? Because a cornfield in North Dakota generates about $600 a year in profits. A cornfield with a wind turbine on it generates $8,600. So everybody wants to put it on, and it's a good thing for our country. It gives family farmers, which are the basis of U.S. democracy, on a strong economic footing. It allows them to make money on their lands. So why aren't they all doing it? They're not doing it because the current AC lines that we have are inefficient, they're misaligned, and they cannot do long-haul transport of energy. So the electrons will diffuse in that line after they've gone 100 miles, and they cross the North Dakota border, and there's nothing left of them. So they cannot get their product to markets in Cleveland, Cincinnati, New Orleans, New York, et cetera, or California, because they don't have a transport system. And a lot of you may say, well, that should come from private property. But my bias on that is the US government has built infrastructure before, and that's part of the job of governments, in my reckoning. We built the Erie Canal in 1825, and it opened up the whole Midwest so that Midwestern farmers could get their produce to markets in Europe without ever taking them off a boat. And it blew up the Midwestern economy. It made New York the biggest port on earth. And it was a benefit to all of us. The road projects in the 1950s that Eisenhower did the same thing. They united us for national security reasons, but they also opened up commerce, and they united our nation as one commercial district. And we need to do the same thing with energy. We need to put DC lines in. We need to unite the grids, and we need to make sure that anybody who wants to sell energy in this country can do so, can get access to the markets. And let me tell you what will happen if we do that. And I'll give you some examples. In 1979, DARPA built the ARPANET grid and created the infrastructure for the internet in this country. And the next year, in 1980, the head of IBM, the CEO of IBM, announced that they were getting out of the PC business, personal computers, because there was no future in it. And a bunch of other companies like Dell made the same bet. They were making PCs, but they didn't see any future in it. And today, every American has a PC, most of us do. But what's happened to the cost of information? It's gone to zero. So, on the way down here, I was thinking about what I was going to say, and I dreamed up a random question. And I asked the internet, what was Mao Zedong's favorite lunchtime meal? And it came back immediately. Fish with the heads, a fatty fish with the heads on it, with cabbage and some other Chinese spices. So if I needed badly to find that information 20 years ago, you know how much that cost me. You'd have to send somebody to the Library of Congress and go through the stacks for weeks, and maybe they'd find it, maybe they wouldn't. But all I had to do was put it into my telephone, and instantaneously the answer comes back. So the cost of bits and bytes of information was zero. And from very, very high zero, that's what's going to happen to electrons if we build a national energy grid. And in 1996, we built a national grid for telecommunications. Bill Clinton told all the baby bells, you got to unify your lines and you got to allow access to the lowest cost for consumers, to the lowest cost providers. And created a real marketplace. And all of these things, gadgets that we all have right now, cell phones, they're all the offspring of creating that national grid for telecommunications. And I'll give you another example. When I was teaching at Pace Law School for about 30 years, there was all the faculty. There was one faculty member named William Weiss. He was the only faculty member who had a phone, a university phone that was authorized to make international calls. So if any of us on the faculty wanted to make an international call, we had to go to William Weiss's office and ask him permission. And I remember, because it was so expensive, I remember making a call from Miami to London, a 5-minute call from my hotel, it cost $75. So that was pretty typical. Now it's free. That's what happened to telecommunications when we created that market. That's what's going to happen to our energy grid. When we create a market, we're going to go to zero cost energy. The cost of electrons are going to go practically to zero. And that will be an enormous boon for the American economy. And it will make us energy independent. It will have all of these benefits for our economy. And we're locked into this system by these impediments that prevent the rationalization of marketplace and the best use of market, the best use and the least expensive power. Oh, I'm gonna talk, I know I said that was the last thing I'm gonna talk about. I'm just gonna say one thing about COVID, which is what we saw in COVID was the acceleration of a process of a trajectory of corporate control, of shifting wealth upward, and of totalitarian control that accelerated what we've seen, happening at least since the beginning of the 1980s, maybe it's my uncle's death. And we saw that the beginning of the pandemic, I won a case last week called Biden versus Kennedy, which ordered the White House to stop censoring speech, stop censoring. And it was a companion case of Missouri versus Biden. And Judge Doty's decision in that case, 155-page decision, talked about how I was the first person that the Biden administration began censoring. They were, within 37 hours of President Biden taking the oath of office, White House officials were emailing Facebook, Instagram, Google, YouTube, and telling them, you have to take Mr. Kennedy down, and you have to, and if you don't do it, we are going to retaliate against you by yanking your Section 230 immunity, which is existential for those companies. If people don't know what Section 230 immunity is, when I used to publish a lot of op-eds from the New York Times, and every time I published one, I would have to talk to the New York Times lawyers who would go through that op-ed and look at every factual assertion I made and make sure that it wasn't libelous or defamatory and that it was true. And so when these internet platforms started, they can't do that because they'd be out of business. They can't put a lawyer examining every post. So the Telecommunications Act gave them an immunity and said, although if I wrote something bad on the op-ed page of the New York Times that was defamatory, the person who I defamed could sue not just me, but the New York Times. So what the Section 230 says is you can sue the person who wrote it. You can't sue the publisher. You can't sue the platform. And it's existential. If they had to review every post with a lawyer, they'd be out of business tomorrow. So the Biden White House was threatening that's what they were going to do if they didn't take down my post. Facebook and Twitter resist, or Facebook, which I didn't use, didn't do anything much. The Facebook did write these interesting loan notes back at the White House where they said he's actually not broadcasting misinformation. What he's saying is true. So the White House had to invent a new word called malinformation, which is information that is true, but nevertheless inconvenient for government officials. And Instagram took down my biggest account, which had almost 1 million people on it. And Twitter then shadow banned me and, slow walked everything and stopped me from broadcasting or growing. And I self-censored after that because I didn't want to lose my followers. So I just, I posted unicorns and butterflies and kittens and, and nothing of consequence. So, okay. Anyway, they started censoring us in March and in earnest. And when they figured out they could get away with it, Hamilton, Madison, Adams said we put freedom of expression guarantees in the First Amendment because all the other amendments, all the other rights are dependent on it. If a government has the power to censor its critics, it has license for every atrocity. As soon as they figured out that we were going to have, that we were going to put up with that, the American people were going to put up, the press was going to support them, et cetera, they started dismantling the Constitution. They went after the other planks of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. They closed every church in our country for a year with no due process, no public hearings, no scientific citations, no environmental impact statements, all the things that, no notice and comment rulemaking, all the things that the democratic procedures that I've been suing governments and companies for 40 years, they just ignored everything. Just one bureaucrat in Washington says masks don't work 1 week, and then 3 weeks later, everybody put one on, and then a week after that, put two on, just utterly arbitrary, which they've now all admitted. They then went after freedom of assembly with these, again, arbitrary and capricious social distancing restrictions, which they now admit they just made up out of thin air. Even, Fauci admitted that. And then went after property rights. They shut down every 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. And they went after, the constitutional guarantees against warrantless searches and seizures with the Fourth Amendment, with all these track and trace surveillance requirements, and that you have to disclose your medical information before you leave your house, before you go into buildings, et cetera. And they went after jury trials. The Seventh Amendment says, no American, no citizen shall be denied a right of a trial before a jury of his peers in case their controversy is exceeding $25. There's no pandemic exception. And by the way, the framers knew all about pandemics. There were two epidemics during the Revolutionary War. There was a smallpox epidemic that debilitated the armies of New England at the very time that we had conquered Montreal. And Benedict Arnold's troops had to withdraw. He was in the middle of the city. They had to withdraw because they didn't have troop support because everybody was down with smallpox. Otherwise, Canada today would be part of the United States. And all the Constitutional Convention knew that. And there was a malaria epidemic that decimated the armies of Virginia. And between the Revolution and the ratification of the Bill of Rights, there were epidemics in every city in this country: cholera, yellow fever, and typhus that killed tens of thousands of people. Most of the people at the Constitutional Convention had relatives who had died during those epidemics. So they knew all about them, but they didn't put that into the Constitution. They wrote the Constitution for hard times, not for easy times. During the Civil War, there were Confederates coming into the northern states as agents provocateurs to try to drum up draft riots in New York and Boston and the other cities. And it was destroying a Union morale. So Lincoln, they knew who these people were, and Lincoln began picking them up the street and confining them. And they sued under the U.S. Constitution at that time. That war killed 659,000 Americans. It's the equivalent of 7.2 million today, much more than COVID. Our country was on the verge of collapse. And yet Judge Taney of the Chief Justice of the Court said, you can't do it. It doesn't matter if the life of the nation is at stake. You can't do it. The Constitution is the most sacred document. It's more important than anything, than human life, everything. And, it was written for hard times. And somehow Americans forgot about that during the pandemic. And, we saw these giant infringements that, that whole structure, the Constitution. And, they'll say, oh, yeah, well, it's all over now. We restored all your. They set the precedent. And once you open that door, the next pandemic, everybody says we're not going to fall that again. But they're making up all kinds of these, bugs, dengue fever, and Ebola that have a 50% mortality rate that actually kill lots of people. Stuff that makes you bleed from your eyeballs, and people will do whatever they're told when they start publicizing that, like they were doing with COVID. So, and the worrying thing is, they now have the capacity for utter control of us. The central ambition of every totalitarian regime in the history of mankind was to control every aspect of human behavior, all of our transactions, all of our interactions. But they never had the ability to do that. But now they do, with AI technology, with facial recognition, 415,000 low altitude satellites. Bill Gates has 60,000 permits for 60,000 satellites, low altitude. He says he's going to be able to look at every square foot of the earth 24 hours a day. So there they have now, these mechanisms that allow you to look through buildings and see if there's people hiding in there. There's going to be no place to hide. And they will have total control. And of course, they're going to have transactional control because of the central bank digital currencies, which is, as free speech and First Amendment. If the framers knew about this, they would have put transactional freedom in there. Because what does free speech mean? If the government could close your bank account and starve you to death, or stop you, as a trucker told me, he couldn't pay his alimony payments up in Montreal because they got shut down, and he was going to jail because he couldn't pay them. Oh, you can't pay your mortgage. You're going to lose your home. You're not going to be able to feed your children. Of course, 99.999% of people will buckle under that. And so, we should have been, with all this technology, these control technologies that are also, by the way, they're corporate technologies. There's a gold rush, an oil rush right now, because they're just stealing all of our private information for free. It's the most valuable asset in history. Every time you cough, every time you sneeze, what you say to your kids, what you say to your wife. Siri is not working for you. It is working for Bill Gates. And, they're mining all this information from it, just it for free. It's the commons. And so there's a huge private profit incentive to expand this system, which is going to pay for its expansion. But then when you expand it, it becomes the instrument for absolute and total totalitarian control. And what we should have been doing if we had a president who, anybody who's like not non-compos mentis, if you had leaders who are saying, holy cow, look what's coming toward us. We need to pour concrete on the Constitution and raise up the bulwarks, and teaching in every school and telling to every person, don't ever let anybody mess with these. And yet they were training us all for 3 years to give it all up. That whenever there's a threat, whenever there's fear, the response is to give up your constitutional rights. They have us all trained. And, we need somebody in the White House who's going to reverse this and understands the peril to our republic and what's happening, and who understands. They're telling us all, oh, if you don't comply, you're going to die. Well, guess what? There's a lot worse things than dying. And one of those is being a slave. And that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed. We're supposed to be the land of the free, the home of the brave. Franklin Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Why did he say that in 1932? He said it because he saw a global depression was being used by fear-mongering totalitarian governments in the right-wing governments in Spain and Italy and Germany, left-wing governments in Russia and Eastern Europe, who were using fear to disable the capacity for critical thinking and to get people to relinquish their rights. And he said, and 30% of Americans believe that capitalism no longer worked and that we had to turn to communism. 30% said we have to turn to fascism. And you had Father Coughlin and Huey Long who were saying, yeah. And Roosevelt said, we're going to do this, and just don't get incapacitated by fear, because you give up all of your values when you do that. And that's what our politicians should be telling us today. We are the land of the free because we are the home of the brave. It's the only way that we're going to keep our freedoms if we renew this resource of courage that has always been part of the American tradition. And instead we have politicians on every side who are trying to, scare us into doing stuff. And anyway, I'm really happy to be here with you. I'm being given a lot of signals to shut up, so thank you. Thank you.